There was a reason Eleanor Marsh had never told anyone she was looking for the lighthouse. She barely understood it herself. A name on a scrap of paper found inside the spine of an old book, a place she had never been, a feeling that pressed against her sternum when she said the name aloud, Heron Point. She was 81 years old and had learned to be quiet about the things that pressed against her sternum. People worried, and worrying made them try to help, and their help had a way of tidying things away before she could understand what they were. Scout lay across the back seat of the car she had borrowed from her neighbor Linda, his long body curved into the upholstery, his black and tan coat picking up the afternoon light in a way that made him look gilded. His ears, those perfect upright triangles, turned toward the window when she rolled it down at the toll booth. He was 7 years old and had come to her 3 years ago from her daughter-in-law Pamela's household, which was to say that Pamela had decided Scout was too large and too demanding, and had announced this over the phone in the calm, informational tone Pamela used for decisions that were already made. Eleanor had driven the 4 hours to collect him without making any particular comment about it. She had been making no particular comment about Pamela's decisions for 11 years. The decision she was not commenting about now was the matter of her late son Daniel's apartment, the one in Portland where he had lived for the last 8 years of his life, the one Pamela had emptied in a week and a half following the funeral, donating or disposing of everything without asking Eleanor if there was anything she wanted to keep. Pamela had called it practical. She had used the word twice in the same conversation. Eleanor had said yes, she understood, and had driven home and sat in her kitchen for the better part of an afternoon before opening the box of Daniel's books she had rescued from the curb the week before, when she happened to be in the neighborhood. She had been in the neighborhood on purpose. The book with the name in the spine was a collection of Lighthouse history, Maine Coast, published 1962, the kind of thing Daniel would have bought at a yard sale for 50 cents. She had been flipping through it when a small folded paper fell from behind the binding. On it, in handwriting she did not recognize, old, careful, a woman's hand, was the name Eleanor Margaret Alcott, and below that, Heron Point Light Station, and below that what appeared to be a parcel number. Eleanor had looked at her own first name, then at the surname she had not used in 53 years. Then she had sat very still for a long time, and Scout had come from wherever he'd been in the apartment and put his muzzle on her arm. She had been Eleanor Alcott before she was Eleanor Marsh. The Alcotts were a family she knew almost nothing about. Her mother had changed the name when Eleanor was 4, following a divorce that was never discussed, and the woman Eleanor's mother had been before that marriage was someone Eleanor had assembled only in fragments. A woman from the Maine coast, practical, largely silent on the subject of the past, who died when Eleanor was 32 and left behind almost nothing that answered questions. The parcel number connected through several hours of online research she had conducted with Scout asleep under the desk to a property in Guilford County, Maine, classified as a lighthouse structure, last assessed at $38,000, held in the name of an estate that had been in probate for 3 years without resolution because no heir had come forward. She had hired a local attorney. The attorney had been interested in the handwriting on the paper. The attorney had spent 2 months tracing the property records and then called Eleanor on a Tuesday morning in early November and said carefully that the situation was unusual but clear. The property had originally belonged to one Margaret Alcott, Eleanor's maternal grandmother who had died in 1989 and whose estate had never been properly administered because no one had been able to locate her daughter. Eleanor's mother, who had changed her name in 1947 and vanished from all records related to the Alcott family. The lighthouse had been sitting in legal limbo for 35 years. As the sole surviving heir, Eleanor was entitled to claim it. She had not told Pamela, she had not told Daniel's children. She had told Linda next door, who had offered her car without asking why. The road to Heron Point wound along the coast through a November landscape, stripped bare and beautiful. Granite outcroppings, dark water, the last of the season's boat traffic gone from the harbors. She drove slowly. Scout had moved from the back seat to the passenger seat at some point on the coast road and sat with his nose against the cracked window, his dark muzzle working in long, slow movements, reading the cold, salt air. She stopped at the Guilford County Library before going to the property because the attorney had told her that the local library kept a historical archive and that the archivist, a woman named Mrs. Pettigrew, had called the attorney's office twice in the past year to ask about the lighthouse. The library was small and warm and smelled of old bindings and radiator heat. Mrs. Pettigrew was in her late 70s and looked up from her catalog work when Eleanor came through the door, and then looked at Scout, and her expression shifted in a way Eleanor noticed immediately. "You're Margaret's granddaughter," Mrs. Pettigrew said. "Not a question." "I am," Eleanor said, "though I didn't know her." Mrs. Pettigrew looked at her for a moment in the measuring way of someone deciding how much weight a particular shelf can hold. "Sit down," she said finally. "I have some things that belong to you." What Mrs. Pettigrew had was a cardboard box she had been holding for 20 years, given to her by Margaret Alcott before Margaret died, with instructions to pass it to any Alcott descendant who came asking about the lighthouse. She had held it through 2 library directors and 1 flood, and a renovation that had displaced the archive for 8 months. She had held it because Margaret had asked her to, and because Mrs. Pettigrew was, as she explained simply, a person who did what she said she would do. "Why did my grandmother give it to you and not to a lawyer?" Eleanor asked. "Because she didn't trust lawyers," Mrs. Pettigrew said, "and because she trusted me, and because she knew that whoever came for it would need to come here first, would need to look in the historical record, and so I would be the right place to put it." She paused. "She was a very organized woman, your grandmother." Eleanor looked at the box. It was sealed with tape that had dried and yellowed at the edges. Scout sat beside her chair and watched Mrs. Pettigrew with his amber eyes. Not suspicious, just attentive in the way he always was when he was deciding whether a situation required him to be alert. "Did you know her well?" Eleanor asked. "Well enough. She talked about your mother sometimes, about the divorce." Mrs. Pettigrew's voice stayed careful and even. "It was a difficult time for your grandmother. She didn't blame your mother for leaving, she understood why. But she never stopped hoping your mother would come back, or that someone would eventually come looking." Eleanor took the box. She thanked Mrs. Pettigrew. Scout stood when she stood and went ahead of her to the door, stopping with one paw on the threshold, looking back at her until she followed. The lighthouse at Heron Point stood on a low, rocky headland at the end of a track that was more suggestion than road. The tower itself was perhaps 40 feet, white brick with a black iron gallery at the top, the light long since decommissioned. Attached to the base was a keeper's cottage, 2 rooms, narrow windows, a door facing the water. Eleanor had the key from the attorney, a large old skeleton key on a lanyard. The drive from the library took 20 minutes. She parked where the track ended and got out. The wind off the water was sharp and smelled of brine and cold stone, and the sound it made against the lighthouse tower was a low, steady hum, almost musical. Scout was out of the car immediately. He moved to the base of the cottage and put his nose to the foundation, working his way along the wall with a focused, methodical attention she had learned to follow. She let him go. She looked at the tower. The cottage door opened with the skeleton key. Inside, the air was cold and still and smelled of salt and something faintly sweet like dried flowers or old soap, a smell that did not belong to a building shut for decades. The walls were whitewashed stone. There was a table, 2 wooden chairs, a cold iron stove, a shelf with nothing on it. One small window overlooked the water. There was another door, interior, that she could see was sealed, not just shut but faced over with new brick, the mortar lines too regular against the older stonework, the color of the brick too pale. Scout found it immediately. He was ahead of her, having come through the door before she registered that he had moved, and when she entered the cottage, he was already at the sealed interior doorway, nose pressed to the joint where new brick met old sill. He stepped back, then stepped forward and pressed his nose to it again. He looked at her with his ears fully forward, and his tail held exactly level, the particular posture he adopted when he had found something and was waiting for her to catch up. She stood in front of the bricked-up doorway and put her hand on the newer mortar. It was cold. It gave slightly under her fingers, not soft exactly, but not the solid resistance of thoroughly cured stone. Someone had done this relatively recently. Years, not decades. She went back out to the car for the toolbox she had packed on a practical impulse. Hammer, chisel, utility knife. Scout followed her out and then followed her back in. He sat directly in front of the sealed doorway and watched her approach it with the chisel. His tail did not move. His ears were fixed forward. She set the chisel point into a mortar line and tapped the hammer once, feeling for resistance. The mortar crumbled at the first real blow. It was soft throughout, done quickly perhaps by someone who knew enough about masonry to make it look right but not enough to make it last. She worked for the better part of an hour, her shoulders aching, stopping twice to rest. Each time she stopped and stood back, Scout would look from the wall to her face and back again, patient and unwavering, as if his stillness were a form of encouragement. When a section of brick finally gave way with a sound like a small landslide and fell inward, he stepped forward and pushed his muzzle into the opening before the dust had settled, breathing deeply, and then stepped back and sat down with his chin lifted, as if he had confirmed something. She widened the hole enough to step through. The room beyond was perhaps 8 feet square, dry despite its position, the floor stone, the ceiling low. On a wooden shelf bolted to the wall were 2 objects, a tin box of the type used for shipping, sealed with a lid that had been soldered shut, and a Sony cassette recorder, old but identifiable, its battery compartment closed. She took both, She sat on the stone floor with her back against the wall and Scout pressed against her side, his flank warm through her coat, and she looked at the cassette player. She opened the battery compartment. Inside were 4 AA batteries, apparently new. Someone had anticipated that when this room was opened, someone would want to listen immediately. She pressed play. The quality was poor, the kind of home recording made on the built-in microphone of a small device, and there was wind noise in the background, or what might have been wind or the ocean very close. But the voice was clear enough. A woman's voice, older, careful with its vowels, the accent of coastal Maine. Eleanor. If you're hearing this, then someone found my note in the book, which means Daniel did what I asked him to do. I gave him the book in 1987 when he came here with his school group, the only one of Margaret Marsh's family I was ever able to reach. I asked him not to tell you about me yet, not until after I was gone, not until it seemed like the right time. I didn't want to upset your life. I wasn't sure you'd want to know. A pause. The sound that might have been water. I'm your grandmother. Margaret Alcott. The reason your mother changed her name was because she was trying to protect me. There was a situation with your grandfather, before the divorce, that I won't go into here because it's over and it doesn't matter anymore. But she thought that by disappearing she would keep me safe, and she was right, and I never blamed her for it. I only wish she had let me tell her that before she died. This lighthouse has been in the Alcott family for 3 generations. My mother kept it. I kept it. It belongs to you now if you want it. There's a deed in the tin box and a letter from an attorney in Guilford who knows the situation. The brick wall was my precaution. I didn't want the property to become a nuisance to the county before you got here. I trusted Daniel to get the book to you eventually. I hope it wasn't too long. Another pause. You look like your mother. Daniel showed me a photograph. You have her eyes. The recording ended. Eleanor sat on the stone floor of the sealed room in the lighthouse at Heron Point with the cassette player in her lap and Scout pressed against her left side, and she held very still. She thought about her mother, the practical, largely silent woman who had remade herself so completely that she had taken the shape of someone with no past, no coastline, no grandmother, still living 40 miles north. She thought about what it cost to disappear so thoroughly that the people who loved you couldn't find you, and what it might have cost to hold that shape for 60 years. She thought about Daniel. 7 years old in 1987, on a school trip she remembered him talking about. She had no memory of what he said specifically, only the general excitement of the coastal trip. He had been 12 when her mother died. He had held this for 40 years and had tucked the book in among his own things and had not told her because he had been asked not to. And Daniel had honored that the way Ruth had honored Harold's drawer, the way good people honor requests they don't entirely understand. Scout had shifted while she sat there. He lay across her feet now, his full weight pinning her ankles to the cold stone, and she was grateful for the weight in the way she was always grateful for the solid, unambiguous fact of him. She opened the tin box with the chisel after a few minutes of work at the soldered edge. Inside was a deed, original, recorded, naming the Alcott family as owners of the Heron Point parcel, with a handwritten codicil in the same careful script as the note in the spine of the book, directing that the property pass to any living descendant of Margaret Alcott upon proof of lineage, the lineage already documented and deposited with the Guilford County Clerk. There was the attorney's letter as promised, and there was a small black and white photograph, palm-sized, of a woman standing in front of the lighthouse tower. She was perhaps 45, straight-backed, her expression neither smiling nor unsmiling but composed, the kind of composed that comes from living at the edge of water for a long time and understanding that the weather is not personal. Eleanor looked at the photograph for a long time. She had her mother's eyes. Her mother had apparently had this woman's eyes. The thing passed down through 3 women who had not stood in the same room together, was looking back at her from a photograph taken decades before she was born, and it was strange and clear and irreducible. She stood stiffly, one hand on the wall. Scout was on his feet before she was fully upright, moving to her left side in the instinctive positioning he adopted when she needed to steady herself, his shoulder at exactly the right height for her hand. She put her hand on him and he held firm. She walked out of the sealed room and through the cottage and stood in the doorway looking at the water. The afternoon was going gray, and the ocean was the color of pewter, and the tower was white against the low clouds. She could hear the wind moving through the iron gallery at the top, that low musical hum she had heard when she arrived. The property would need work. The cottage roof had at least 2 compromised spots she could see from here. The access road was barely usable. There would be county conversations and legal processes and expense that she had not fully calculated. Pamela would call it impractical. Pamela would use the word twice. She stood in the doorway for a while longer, her hand still on Scout's back, and then she went inside and built a small fire in the iron stove with the driftwood she found stacked in the corner. recent, dry, placed there with the same forethought as the batteries in the cassette player. Her grandmother had been a very organized woman. Eleanor stood at the stove and felt the first small heat and looked around the cottage with its whitewashed walls and narrow window and the sealed room now open behind her, and she thought that she had spent 81 years not knowing this place existed. She thought that perhaps the most useful thing a person could do with that kind of information was simply to begin. Scout walked to the doorway of the opened room and stood there for a moment looking in. Then he turned and came back and lay down in front of the stove, tucking his nose under his tail. His sides moved in the slow, relaxed rhythm of a dog who has finished what he came to do. His ears, for the first time all day, folded back into the soft resting position that meant he had nothing left to listen for. Eleanor sat beside the stove in the keeper's cottage at Heron Point and listened to the ocean and held a photograph of a woman she had never met, who had nevertheless kept a room waiting and filled a cassette with her voice, and trusted a child and a librarian and a lighthouse on a rocky Maine headland to eventually bring someone home.